A flow state scale has kind of these 3 core dimensions that I like to cite. A lot of the Csikszentmihalyi work, he kind of was the originator of flow. His book in 1990 kind of set the groundwork for a whole series of experiments that have been happening, over the last 30 years there. And the 3 I really like to key in on are absorption, effortless fluency or fluidity of the activity that you're doing, and lastly, intrinsic motivation. And I think these 3 components, it's really about all of them being present when we're defining a flow state rather than maybe one of them only. If you want to have a deep lesson of like all the yogic training and the meditation and understanding the brain and neuroscience and music and like these pieces put together, is just like in a moment of uncertainty, do less things that are coming internally directed from you and from internal attention, and focus on the external.
Have you ever experienced one of those moments where you're so deeply immersed in what you're doing, maybe playing music, writing, or even losing yourself in a great conversation, so much so that the world just fades away and every action feels effortless? This is the essence of a flow state, a psychological phenomenon first explored by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in his 1990 book, Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience. Since then, flow has garnered significant interest within the health community, particularly among those aiming to enhance their cognitive performance. Today, we're diving into the science of flow states with Dr. David Rosen, a cognitive neuroscientist whose work explores flow states from the perspective of music, creativity, and altered states of consciousness. With a PhD from Drexel University, Dr. Rosen has spent years studying the brain's role in flow, particularly through jazz improv, where he's uncovered how expertise shapes the neural pathways behind creative performance. At Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, he investigates how music influences psychedelic experiences, offering fresh perspectives on mental health and the nature of consciousness. Dr. Rosen's research not only deepens our understanding of the brain, but it also speaks to anyone who's ever felt fully immersed in a creative moment, and those who'd like to more easily enter flow state. Dr. Rosen also co-founded Chord Laboratories, which used AI to predict how music resonates with listeners, blending neuroscience with real-world applications in the music industry. Dr. Rosen himself is in fact an accomplished musician. The music you're hearing right now is from his band Outer States, and the track is called Flow States 2. Join me in vivo with Dr. Rosen on the science of flow state. So, Dr. Rosen, you study flow state at the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins, which is something I've thought a lot about as a former struggling musician doing lots of improvisation, and now a lecturer that speaks for hours at a time sometimes. It's become increasingly popular among health enthusiasts, especially those that want to sort of optimize their cognitive performance. How did you get involved in studying flow, and what's your relationship been like over the years with flow? As I understand, you're also a musician.
Yeah. Flow is really a personal topic for me. The research that I do today looking at flow and specifically creative flow states really came out of my own music practice, similar to how you've described your own music background. And we've talked a little bit about that kind of before this. And I think it's something that like really drives a lot of behavior. It's really exciting to me to feel like, there are motivations that are intrinsic, that people truly just feel pleasure and like human flourishing out of. As a psychologist, so much of our focus, whether it's at a center where we're doing research on psychedelics, or in other clinical practices around, is so much on kind of, anxieties and stress and depression. And those are really important things that, clinical issues we need to be looking at. But it's really important, I think, that we look at human well-being, and think about that as the forefront. And just knowing the role it's played in my life, I'd say that, I just became really passionate and like ravenous about finding out what was happening at like various levels of thinking about flow as like both an experience, a phenomenology, what that experience is kind of like to the person, but also trying to dig in to look at it more quantitatively and objectively via neuroscience.
Right. And what's really cool about your work, and I came across your work because I saw your Scientific American paper, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but you look at it from a creative music and altered states sort of lens, which is really cool because I think a lot of people can connect with it that way. So before we move on and get into the science of it, why don't we define flow sort of in two ways? Let's define it in sort of a layperson way, how somebody would describe it, as they do when they play music, but also more of a scientific way, more quantitative way that you've sort of looked at it from that lens.
Sure. Like, I guess, let me take a step. I feel like, Tim, let me take a full step. It's like a step back, right?
Please.
And I'll dive into flow. I just want to kind of like be clear where I'm coming from on that is that, so just like, I'm a postdoc right now, as you mentioned, at Hopkins, the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research, right? So flow is kind of like, that was a lot of my dissertation work actually was kind of like leading in there. And one of the things I was excited about doing is bringing this idea about flow states, kind of like within the realm of more like psychedelic research. It hasn't really been kind of one of the things people have been looking at yet, and I know it's an exploding exploding area. Like, and it's considered like, as you're thinking like, how are these things related? Like you mentioned, altered states of consciousness. If you think of them as like kind of like on a spectrum, people experience flow can in their day to day life. Other altered states, kind of like awe. Also, you can imagine it was another altered state, like maybe further down the scale towards like the weaker side versus like a full psychedelic experience or like a meditational enlightenment through a practice of many years. And this wide range of different types of altered states of consciousness, I think, is really what I think has tied this all together and has brought me to kind of where we are. And as I mentioned, that came from solos, from being absorbed, right? That's a key. I'll get into like now your flow question, just as I like to like lay that groundwork of like, these peak experiences often happen, I think, and are linked to these altered states of consciousness, right? It's like we have these really amazing moments, and it's interesting. Like when I think back and think about these altered states being laid across like a scale of different types, and I look into these awe and flow and meditation and yoga, which I've had a practice for a decade, and music improvisation and like appreciating beautiful things around me. They all just kind of resonate with this, luminescence or positivity of like what the best parts of living are. Mm-hmm. And so I come from that perspective, and defining things like flow, get tricky because there's a lot of different things that people do that are their flow. So how can you create this kind of construct that also encompasses those things? And there are great scales out there. So I guess one of the ones we use, the flow state scale, has kind of these 3 core dimensions that I like to cite. A lot of the Csikszentmihalyi work, he kind of was the originator of flow. His book in 1990 kind of set the groundwork for a whole series of experiments that have been happening, over the last 30 years there. And the 3 I really like to key in on are absorption, effortless fluency or fluidity of the activity that you're doing, and lastly, intrinsic motivation. And I think these 3 components, it's really about all of them being present when we're defining a flow state, rather than maybe one of them only. And from what I can tell, a lot of the work that I've seen on this topic has really looked at single kind of dimensions or aspects of the construct. And just recently, I think there's been a push with myself and some other flow researchers out there to kind of like think about this as think about moving forward with kind of some agreed upon scales and definitions and ways of thinking about this. So I'll lay that groundwork there. That's kind of where we are and how I think about it. Happy to dive into like more dimensions from the classic like canonical flow work if you're interested.
What I really like is you just described it on the onset there as peak performance or peak experience. Actually, I think is the word that you
peak
use.
Experience.
That's interesting because you can be involved in something that's entertaining, great experience, but in certain moments there's a peak that occurs where you have that effortlessness that's happening and you're totally in the zone. I think that's probably how a lay person who might not know what flow is might describe it as.
Totally. Zone. Yeah.
In the zone.
You nailed it. Yeah. A video game, like writing, painting, like going on a walk, like I think there's like aspects of repetition that goes into it, like where I know it's been like that I like to draw parallels for my own life, right? It's like music and yoga and like hot yoga. It's like the parallel of like in the hot room, I'm doing that for 10, it's like 105 degrees. You're in there for like anywhere between 60 and 90 minutes. And it's like there's aspects of will and discipline and of like mind over body. And that just like they come into play that feel off kiltered from when I'm doing almost anything else. And that's flow. That's being in the zone where you're just dialed in. Like when you have total focus, sometimes like time is distorting, right? It just feels good. It's a sense you feel in control, but at the same time, not like overly bearing. And part of it as like when we talk about specific domains and domain expertise and like experts in an area, that's been a big kind of factor in the work that I've looked at. And what gets me really excited is kind of when we start to think about the way our minds are working and think about our thinking or metacognition or meta control. It's like then part of your like training and part of your experience is not just like the years and like the depth of knowledge is kind of one component that I think more readily associate with someone who is an expert. We think they have this experience. They've encountered a situation before. They know how to respond, or like they have this deep, just understanding of the domain. But part of that is understanding of how you need to set yourself in a given setting. And I'll tie that all kind of back, this idea of now at the CPCR for psychedelics, we talk a lot about set and setting when we talk about just transformative experiences, period, whether they be through psychedelics. That's kind of where the terms originated back in the first wave of research about set and setting back from the 60s and 70s when people were looking at psychedelics and how crucial these pieces are. And this set is really ultimately like your mindset, your background, what you're coming with to the table. So if it's for a flow experience, you could be like, well, someone who's coming to the table with really high anxiety, for example, right, or face really high anxiety, let's say mixed with a situation that induces really high stress. Let's say I have to go, we'll keep with the music theme, right? Let's say I'm generally an anxious person, and now I have to go perform my big concert in front of 1,000 people. I've never played in front of more than 100 people before. And this one really matters. There's going to be critics, and all my classmates are going to be there, and my friends and my family.
Interesting.
Right? So you think about these different components of the set of the person and then the setting, the situation around them. And I think you start to, I'll bring it back to this experience thing a little bit more, is that you can start to help yourself and like realize what causes non-flow,
right?
What's happening when you're not there and what's happening when you're there, and start to try to, make very small adjustments along the path. And I think that's small adjustments along the path is just like adaptation is at the core of like what makes us human.
Now, what's interesting, so yeah, like the set that you just mentioned, like the anxiousness, the first thing that I thought about was actually recently my younger daughter, she's going to be 5, and she had her first ballet performance, and she was not anxious at all. And when she had no idea what to expect, and she gets up on stage, it was a legit show. There was like 600 people in the crowd.
Wow.
And she was not nervous at all.
What type of dance did she do?
It was ballet. And she was basically just handing out props to the main principal dancers who wasn't really dancing. But she wasn't anxious at all. And she was totally in the zone. And so I could imagine, and on the flip side, there were some children there that were totally anxious. Yes. And you could see how it affected them. So I wonder whether or not my daughter was in a flow state, whether the other children were in a flow state. I guess it brings me to a question is, do we know whether or not children can enter flow state? Because it seems like they can, especially when they're playing. And is there a correlation between flow state and age? Can you get better at it, or is it easier as you get older?
I haven't seen too much work looking at specifically at age outside of the expertise realm. I love your daughter's example. I have a 4.5-year-old daughter also. Was your daughter dancing in a group?
Well, yeah, it was. There was about all the students at the ballet school were there, so there was about 30 people on stage at one point.
And she's been practicing with these people and getting ready for the performance.
Yes,
basically, she was doing this? Was she like ready at home? Was she doing the show? Was she practicing for you?
She was practicing a little bit,
Like-
and I was curious before the show even started. Are you anxious? What, like, are you nervous? Without trying to get her to be nervous. And she was totally cool, and she has never performed at all, so
Totally cool.
she didn't know what to expect, and I think that sort of helped her with the set and the set.
Sure, that's definitely true. I mean, kids don't have. I think back in terms of like developmentally, when I really started to get more concerned about this idea of like people could think of me badly. This like theory of like taking another person's mind and perspective of like the way that now others think about me. As you start to develop that, I think it's around like 3rd, 4th grade, 9, 10 years old.
Right.
The social pressures become such now that you have a different response to that maybe first time ever performance.
Right.
I think as a kid, you still have, luckily you still have this lack of this
naivety,
uninhibited, naivety where you can go up there and just kind of do what you do and not even, and just love it and be engrossed in the moment and take the applause. My daughter she sings at home. She'll like go crazy with me at home and in the car. She had a show where she came up on stage, similar age bracket, I guess. She's 4.5. She came up on stage to do a song with her class, and they practiced it a bunch of times. Looked into the room. She's done this like before when she was younger and probably doesn't remember it. And was nervous. Got up there, was kind of quiet. I think when she's outside of the home, just generally in that environment, is more quiet. And it took until seeing like us, she like had to locate us and got like lit up, and then was like, oh, I see them, everything's okay. I want to like perform. I'll tie that back. Is that flow? So like, are those children's moments where we as the parents are putting them in the position through maybe the motivation is, is ours. But I don't know that would qualify if I was trying to follow a strict definition of what would I call flow out in the world when I'm like, things that I would definitely been into flow. I don't think that I would put that there because I think it misses intrinsic motivation that they didn't find their way. The child didn't find their way there like by themselves. You could pick at that and say, well, does anyone really find their way to anything by themselves without some type of extrinsic force around it? I mean, you could motivation theorists say that there is intrinsic motivation. Maybe it's not absolute in its form, but that it is different from doing things in exchange for either when it's not your decision or in exchange for like money, like when work is involved, that now your motivation is, we'll call it contaminated, right? To a higher degree than, lots of other types of activities that are more, I like to say along the lines of hobbies, generally where the incentive is clearly outside of it's for you. Right. It's really for you. It's for doing the activity for the sake of doing it.
So we've been discussing flow just for the first 15 minutes here in the context of arts and creativity. Does one have to be engaged in a creative pursuit? Because that's a lot of what you study to enter flow state, or can you enter flow states doing things that are a little bit more mundane, not creative? You're not turning on that part of your brain. Does it have to be creative?
Doesn't have to be creative. That was the last paper, the Scientific American one you pointed out. That was kind of my first focus really on flow specifically. I've been doing previous work on creative cognition, creative processing and neuroscience. And for me, the flow piece of that was just like saying, it's really important to get it when we were evaluating creativity in the world. It's important to know what's happening, what's the experience is like for the person who's generating the creativity. We often judge creativity by just looking at a product at the end of the day and saying, this was creative or not. And I think maybe that's why we generally in this framework, it points in creativity research, it points to musicians and dancers a lot. There's a little more in terms of comedians because there's like a clear output in the world that people consume and enjoy. There's like this aesthetic appeal about creativity, but I don't think flow itself is just for creativity. It's where I've focused my work because that's been the kind of overlap between just my circle of interests and background. It's for athletes. I mean, that's a very highly cited. Athletes is a huge one. Like back in the 70s, when Csikszentmihalyi was kind of doing the interviews that would serve as the basis for kind of his ideas of flow theory, they were based on these qualitative interviews with eminent musicians and athletes and talking to them about like what their experience was when they were having this like in the zone groove moments. And those were how the original dimensions of kind of flow were conceptualized. So athletics, you could organize sports that, fixing something, being a mechanic, fixing a bike, fixing a car, a construction worker who's like takes, great, pride and like goes into this as like, and started building things from the time, someone who was like building the things from the time that they were a kid and like started making buildings and like went through the ranks. I don't know, like it became whatever. These could all be related to flow. So and having flow, though they might be, I would say that different. Some things are going to be different about those activities from the creative ones. And yeah, I think there may be some overlap as well, but we don't really know in terms of the underlying neurophysiology of these different states because they're so vast.
Are there any theories as to whether or not flow state has any evolutionary utility? Why we may have been able to develop that over evolutionary time?
It's a good question. Well, I guess if it's related to optimal performance. So if we think about just evolutionary theory, if we can get into a place where we could develop, it's really interesting, right? It's like you need to kind of have this cognitive control and sense to be able to take in information in a controlled, active way where you're like learning information of a domain. I think like without that information, without having that like prerequisite knowledge and experience, I think it's really hard to call it flow. So we have the ability to learn, but then you need the ability of like learning what it's like to take the information and then interact in a way that is like that you're absorbed and fluid in a physical environment, in a physical reality. And we've evolved to be able to literally do that, to learn a lot of things. And then somehow with all this like depths of information, parse the most important pieces for a given moment and problem. And I think that emerges ultimately as flow is tied into creativity. That's why the creative flow for me, or creative problem solving, you can think about flow states of like thinking about scientific theories. You can be in thinking for like flow during what you're thinking. And like you could definitely recall moments where, I can deep after a day of work, I'm in my car driving home and my flow is like this weird mix of like the music, the task of driving, but like my thoughts are in flow. There's such clarity around like the pieces of my day, the lingering pieces of my day. I don't think flow researchers don't think about, I don't think we like ever, I haven't seen much around like this idea of like flow thinking and if that's related to, would that even be called flow? And if that's related, now your work is like creeping in. So you have this like one part of it, right, is not, now you're not intrinsically motivated anymore. You're not like sitting working your whole life to like think better and better about your work. But maybe you have been living your life to like think about, you've developed a way to think about whatever has been happening. It's not just work. It's like different pieces of a relationship or like things that you have coming up that you care about. Because if there's one thing, like your motivation, your intrinsic motivation for propelling yourself and trying to live your best life and your best existence and to deal with whether it's problems or commitments or your schedule and to be able to like best maneuver through those different, we'll call them responsibilities, whatever, that in itself could be extremely adaptive.
This idea of intrinsic motivation, that's something I never thought of, but it's the idea of intrinsic motivation is almost intrinsic in that you don't think about it, but you try to find it, I guess, as a younger person, find what you're really interested in. So I think that's what you're getting at, is something that you are intrinsically motivated to pursue. And therefore not that it becomes easier, but I guess it's easier to allocate more of your brain to a certain task because you're intrinsically motivated. I think that's sort of what you're getting at.
I think so. And that's what I'm getting at. If I'm not saying that, or if I'm not articulating that well, that is what I'm getting at. Like I'll tie it back to like the discipline and like the structure and like just like the pings of like every notification that we're like getting constantly, and like the ideas around deep work from Cal Newport over Georgetown, like that stuff just maybe that shows my age. I'm an older head. I crossed 40 recently, and like I feel like a sadness that of like having the experience of growing up kind of without the constant notification, because like I feel like I'm one of the, I feel like I like see it happen where it's like a relic of like deep, it's like this idea of like kind of deep work that's like so tied to flow. And I'm hoping that part of my like excitement about the flow research is I think it's like this like kind of relatable like psychological aspect that like people of all ages, like we kind of know about the distractions, we know about the attention control of like social, like these different pieces, and to like have this awareness and to have these like kind of outlets in science around like something that can really like better us. You mentioned the evolutionary stuff, and like I kind of gave a long-winded answer, but like a couple of quick just like points on that is I think one, flow is like saying, yeah, you're doing something important. You're doing something like right and important. Keep doing it. Right. And that keeps like pushing us forward. Like flow, I think like really helps us to think about the complex, I mentioned like complex behaviors and skills that we've learned in a domain, but like continue to help us like continue to require like social coordination and motor coordination in the world, that like physical aspect. I mentioned that physical world aspect a lot because I don't know. I guess we think about we talk about consciousness a lot in the lab, and AI is a really hot and pressing topic.
Sure.
And consciousness and these like intersections. And I did some work in a like a robotics lab, an electrical engineering lab when I was doing my doctoral work. And you know, all these LMMs, and AI, it's like exact for like parsing huge blocks of text and doing these things. Like they're like the amount of information that can be consumed and synthesized. You know, people are looking to see what the expanses are and like in growing these networks. But the real challenge is like building robots in the physical and like interacting in the physical world.
That's right.
In unique situation, in unique situations where you don't have like one PhD built to like have a robot do one task, like and you know, there's been great advances there as well. I mean, you go to California now and you're riding around, right? You're riding in cars. But I think just really tying, like, when you look at an expert in some domain, you just think, how is that possible? I think I look at athletes, or I look at visual artists, I look at dancers, I look at things, and it looks easy. It's like, how did you get to the point? Any domain, anyone great anywhere, like.
I'm glad you brought that up. You said it looks easy, because one of the things that I got out of Csikszentmihalyi's 1990 book is that he says that skill has to match the challenge, and there has to be a balance between skill and challenge, and that's sort of one of the requisites that he puts out there. So when they make it look easy, that's exactly what I think he's getting at.
Yeah, like they make it look. So is that okay? So I'll flip that around. Like, is the musician? It's looking easy. What does that, for you, the perceiver? What does that mean about like what's actually happening for the musician? Like, it's something to consider, and like maybe that's just like a part of the stage. Like they're an experienced musician, and that's part of their stage expertise or stagemanship is just like being a performer. Is no matter what's happening, they can get on stage and like kind of, you know, get away with almost anything, and they could be having like a really bad night. Yeah, I think, and you wouldn't know. We've all had. We've all had it.
You know it when you feel it. You know it when you see it.
If you saw me having a bad night, you would know that I'm having a bad night. Unfortunately, but the balance between challenge and skill is a key component. It's been the most studied actual dimension of Csikszentmihalyi's original work. A lot of the flow state work, which actually I take issue with a little bit, is that people will like give participants, researchers will give them like a video game, like a Tetris type thing, or something that gets adaptively harder, or like even math problems based on your level, and give you like problems that are not too hard but not too easy, where people report like medium amounts of boredom.
Right.
And they say like that medium amount is flow. And like everything we've talked about so far, Tim, today, like about the intrinsic motivation and like absorption in the task, and how this like becomes this personal like discipline and thing that you engage in for the sake of doing it. Like you're really missing, I think, the essence. Those studies are really missing the essence of what Csikszentmihalyi was going out there to investigate about. When you try to like overly simplify or define something by like only one slice of maybe what's important around it. But on the flip side, the interesting thing about the chill skill balance, the challenge skill balance is that kind of brings back the example of your daughter or younger people, maybe like, she's not an expert dancer, but maybe she's been doing dance for a year, and that she will have moments of flow as she like continues to do the thing, to make friendships through the dance classes, to like have a routine where she starts looking forward to it, not because it's like the first times and you or whatever, but like now it starts to become hers. She starts not only to form experience with something, doing it repetitively, but also starts to like embody it as part of her own identity and meaning making in the world. And that's another piece of flow we haven't really talked about too much. It's maybe comes out through the way kind of we were talking about like the music and these different topics, but that meaning making is, I think, at the core of like things like self life satisfaction and feeling like you have like you have a life like worth living, and we know that the sense of self and identity are so crucial to just like our health and well-being. And at the same time, our sense of self and over focus and maybe constraints on ourself and who we are and what matters as we age and as different things happen in our lives, different things pop up, could also lead to unhealthy outcomes.
But as an educator, wouldn't it be wonderful to sort of have that in the back of your mind, the skill and challenge scale, and sort of try to structure your class or your lecture or whatever it is that you're teaching, biology, psychology, or ballet, and try to keep those students right in that optimal skill challenge scale.
Yeah, you're a professor, so it's been a while since I did my education degree, but it was all about differentiated learning, right? And that's really hard thing. That's a really hard thing.
It's a hard thing to do. Yeah,
it's a difficult thing to pull off in a classroom. Depending on the level, I mean, at any level, I think it's difficult. Like I taught it. We haven't gotten this. I used to be an educator. I was a 6th grade teacher for 3 years before I went back to grad school. I had kids in my classroom who were on a reading level from 2nd grade up through 10th grade, and I was the only person in the classroom with 32 kids, of which like half of them were like serious behavior issues,
which is like the average problem that every teacher has. It sounds like
it was. I mean, it was. I mean, exaggerated maybe because I was in Philadelphia proper, but like, I mean. And then at college, there's similar, even a gap of, I had students in college courses who could barely write. It felt like they were writing at maybe like a 6th, 7th grade level, and others who were like, ready to like publish, like write publishable work almost, or close to it. And that, I think, like the students, if you think about who's experiencing flow in a room, like who is this geared towards? Like if I'm making a talk, or like how can I scaffold my information where that's how I used to think of it, really. And like you might too, is like, here is like, there's different like kind of levels of information. And I want to start like the topmost levels, or maybe almost like, I would like almost they're like almost like kids would just do them and take advantage of additional opportunities, whether they be writing or like things that are like above and beyond. But like the core class material, like core, like at least vocabulary and concepts I want them to understand, and like giving maybe like, and really focusing that time on like, what are my main objectives and goals? And then like, how can I add in supportive, supplementary like material where the highest achieving student can like do like research that's like almost like take this to the degree of like, I have an idea of like, wow, how this psychological how this matches how like flow is involved in this thing in my life that I've never heard about that before, all the way to just like being able to say, maybe like, give me 2 or 3 things that define, like thinking about flow. What are the 3 kind of core elements of flow? Would be like, I want it to be like absorption, effortless, fluency, and intrinsic motivation. Right. And then we can, from the concept, we can like grow and get as deep as we can from there. But challenge and skill are going to be important. And that level of flow, optimal performance, right? If a student's like distracted and not there and not absorbed and then distracted and all those things, like they're not going to get much out of that course.
No, I definitely want to get into some strategies with you on how people can improve their ability to get into flow. But why don't we talk about your paper, since it's how I came across your work. Paper, as well as the article in Scientific American, which is Brain Scans of Jazz Musicians Reveal How to Reach a Creative Flow State. Super interesting. One of the coolest experiments that I've seen, mainly because I myself am a guitarist, and to see somebody use jazz musician, in particular jazz guitarist, as a data set is just awesome. So why don't you tell us about a little bit of how you set up the experiment and what you learned?
Sure. So let's see. We had 32 different jazz guitarists come in. We wanted to see first, just leading into the experiment, if we could record good guitar data with like as little movement as possible. The recording is a challenge.
Right.
Almost the majority of studies use pianists, almost like all music kind of neuroscience studies. Usually ones that are fMRI, they do that because they have like a non-ferromagnetic keyboard that they can bring with them in a scanner. Being in an fMRI scanner, you'd think that's like a challenging environment to improvise in.
Yeah.
So like laying on your back kind of like with one hand and like this little MIDI controller. So there were these past studies, not really a flow of improv. There's improvisation studies of musicians in jazz that date back to about 2007, 2008. Actually, Csikszentmihalyi was on one of those studies in 2007, looking at like kind of class. This is more of like a classical music improvisation. And there was a jazz study right a year after that by Lim and Braun in 2008. They were looking at improvisation versus just memorized melodies. But for me, I wanted to try to get the most ecologically valid. I wanted to get people in the setting like as comfortable as they could. And so with EEG, one of the advantages is you have a cap on your head. You don't have to lay backwards. So musicians are in there with their guitars. They're sitting like comfortably upright with a music stand in front of them with their changes. And they would come in, they would get capped, and they would like play for a while. And one of the most important parts of this study, I think, was that like literally for 10 minutes, they had chord changes, they had their brain activity on a screen in front of them, and they would start to play. And after a couple of minutes of playing, just getting comfortable, I would be like, okay, you see these brain waves? And I would start to have them do things. I would have them like clench their jaw. I would have them bob their head. I would have them do all the things they weren't supposed to do.
Right.
And so there was this adjustment period of like just working with the musicians to try to get them into a place where they're like this, they understood, okay, this is like about the amount of motion that we would want.
So I think that was really a baseline.
We're setting a baseline, and the brainwaves weren't on the screen once we started recording the improvisation, but just getting them, setting a baseline, getting them comfortable, letting them play for a while. This is like a little like nerdy thing that like didn't even really make it into the methods of the paper. But when I think about the design of the paper, the important parts and the questions going into the study one was just like, can we get musicians to improvise and collect EEG data that we think has high enough fidelity that we could like, do some cleaning and run all of our fancy analyses on it to understand what's kind of going on in the brain. So basically what we had was these 32 musicians had a wide range of expertise. They came in, they improvised to, I've used Band in a Box or actually iRealbook for this study. It's a cool app where you can program any set of jazz changes with like an accompaniment. So there was guitarists came in, and then there was piano, bass, and drums accompaniment. They were all the same tempo. They were 144 beats per minute, like kind of like a medium swing kind of vibe. The chords were changing like on every chord. They were unfamiliar chord changes, which was a decision made for the bigger creativity realm of this study not to have this familiarity effect. But in some ways, if I designed this study from scratch, I think I would have like actually had pieces that were like jazz standards that people were the most familiar with, because I think we talked about set and setting earlier, like the setting or the piece. I'll tell you from my own experience, I'm sure like when you're comfortable with a piece and you have all these different iterations that your memory can reform those in different ways. It's different. It's different. And I think it's more what real jazz, like deep improv or improv in any domain comes from. It comes from this deep repertoire and vocabulary that's like puts piece together. Right. So that's it's a little bit of a caveat there. That I like to talk about because, everything can always be improved. But I guess getting to like kind of what we saw was basically, I think for me, the highest level findings, we saw a unique network of brain areas in the high experts in our group. So all of our analyses, we kind of looked at high experts in high flow, this left lateralized network of temporal lobe and sensory motor areas kind of areas you would think kind of would be recruited maybe during, like when you're doing listening to music, playing music, like kind of motor tasks, and really none of like frontal brain areas were active during that condition. So kind of that was only in high experts, only during high expertise. So it's kind of this idea of like when you're in flow and you have the expertise, kind of this network kicks in that is like, okay, I'm kind of like letting go. Right. I'm going to let like auditory and like what I hear and how I know like I should move and like how these things kind of all form together. I'm going to let that network take over when I like step into an improvisation.
That was one of the questions you went into it with, was whether or not flow requires extreme concentration or letting go. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong. And ultimately you learn that it's the letting go, which is more important.
Yes. Well, the letting go, the two comparisons, I'll clarify that a little bit, was whether we need to recruit kind of more frontal executive processes,
right,
and help with ideation. And there's this, and with more standardized tasks, there's been a big push in the creativity realm between this idea of like there's greater connectivity between these like kind of control regions and the default mode network, kind of like this self-referential area, and like we're tied into kind of like your memory and sense of self and kind of inner dialogue. It's the network that comes online when you're actually like not doing an active task. So in creativity, we see is that like these areas are connecting. What we saw, so it's kind of like, what do we see with the default mode network? Is it something that's becoming more connected with like frontal brain areas, the state of like a kind of a associative processing or ideation? Or is it more of like this optimized processing model where this unique network of brain areas is kicking in that has been developed through this optimized processing through experience, right? And comparing these different ideas is like, how does this model of creative flow compare to kind of the prevalent FM like neuroimaging model of creative ideation, given that the creative idea that work is not on a intrinsic motivated domain. It's usually things like alternate uses tasks or something like name how many uses you can think of for a brick or how many for a pencil. And you come up with lots of different divergent thinking tasks, really. So, you have a difference of task. And I think I'll keep coming back to throughout this, we've been talking this intrinsic motivation, like kind of, I think it's really what separates it. And we keep coming back to it. It's like, how personally meaningful is this task to you? Like, and that through line, I think through a lot of your questions and a lot of our conversations today keeps popping up as like that distinct part of it, in combination with absorption and like effortless fluency that like really is just like at the heart of I think why I study and why I care about it and why lots of people out there, I think, look to achieve it in what they do.
So how did you ultimately rate? So you had, was it 90 jazz guitarists?
We had 32 jazz guitarists. We had 100. There were six improvisations each from them. So we had them rated by jazz experts. So we had a couple. I had a teacher of mine who had been playing jazz. Man, he's a UArts isn't there anymore. He is a jazz teacher. I mean, he's played back in the day with Stevie Wonder. He's been playing for like 40 years. He was one of them. I had another violinist, jazz violinist for 15 years. Just different music people in my life who had four of them. They really high. We just had them rate each improvisation for aesthetic appeal and technical proficiency and creativity. And those were all highly correlated for jazz solos, as you can imagine, like on the order of above 0.9. So we just ended up like kind of squashing them into an average quality score or average creative quality score. So we got these objective ratings from objective ratings from judges. We got self-rated. Right. We had the musicians rate their sense of flow and generally how well they did on the performance. And then we had the EEG and we had the EEG data, which was kind of showing us this unique network that was popping out. Also, one thing we could dive right back, but one thing I forgot to mention was to use a very cool method, deep source reconstruction on our EEG data. Yantek O, he's my collaborator on that project. And we identified regions of the default mode network, a couple of posterior regions, both right and left posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus, where what we saw was more activation in high experts when they were in low flow.
Oh, that's interesting.
So that's like kind of our interpretation of that, is that somehow like, so it's the flip side. It's the other end of the network. So that frontal parietal default mode network, right? So the frontal parietal is going to span from, frontal regions to the back, towards the back of the brain. And the default mode sits kind of also within the posterior regions. We didn't see the frontal areas. When those areas were connecting, we talked about creativity. Now with the jazz flow task, we saw an increase was actually associated with worse performance rather than improved creative ideation in this area. So is it the people's self narrative or doubt, when that happens, it gets in their way of the optimal processing? Instead, it's like distracting from, the letting go, and they're almost getting in their own way. But that's only happening in the high experts when they're not experiencing flow.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a lot of interpretation at this point. It's one study. It's one area. But if there were to be an overlapping, like a like domain general that's like just relates to flow, not just in creativity, but in lots of different, not just music improv, but lots of creative and non-creative domains. My hunch would be is like that self kind of thought and talk is almost antithetical to being absorbed. Right?
Yeah. And
so I could see that being maybe a domain general kind of neural correlate of a flow state, and that network that kind of left lateralized temporal and parietal central network of like jazz musicians. I can imagine thinking that expertise network moves around the brain through different areas depending on what your topic of expertise is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And pardon me, in that study, the more experienced jazz musicians, they were objectively rated as having a better flow or entering flow as compared to the more novice performers, which I think is a logical conclusion. You might hypothesize or guess that in advance, but it was the difference in the default mode networks which really stood out between the experts and the novices. Do I understand that correctly?
So the big difference, I would say, the default mode network came out in the full group high and low flow areas of the default of posterior cingulate cortex. I would say the most clear, which is a node of the network. The most clear distinction of default mode network activity was when we subsetted within just the high experts.
Okay.
Right. So we saw more default mode network activity when high experts were reporting low flow.
Gotcha.
Low flow. So it was like kind of getting in this idea of like getting in the way of optimal processing.
Understood. How much do you think, how much of flow do you think is innate versus a skill that can be trained? Are some people basically born with the ability to enter flow better, because of their brain physiology?
It's interesting. Like there are disposition, like a lot of work on flow proneness and dispositional. I haven't seen too much work. Like it's a really good question. Like maybe not even just like resting state data, even just like resting state, like take people who are high in flow proneness and low in flow proneness, and like what does their activity look like doing X, Y, and Z activity. And
see how much delta there is between that.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like pretty straightforward work. Maybe I'm just not familiar with that literature. I'm really more familiar with like kind of I know there's like other traits that would make flow harder or easier. Like we mentioned, if you're high in like
anxiety,
like absorption, anxiety is one we mentioned, right? And like an intelligent absorption scale, or there's like an absorption in music. So there's all these different absorption scales that, that makes sense that if you would have a certain level or threshold of becoming absorbed in order to experience flow or be more likely to experience flow. That comes down to the right nature, like nature nurture. Like I think, there's gonna be pressures on both sides. Nature nurture is literally maps on to me as set and setting.
Yeah. It's just another way to say it, essentially.
Yeah. It's really just another way to say it. And it can be extracted to be everything, right? Like to some degree, it's like, okay, set and setting is now it's something very specific in the realm of like altered states of consciousness and like psychedelic experiences and all these different things we talk about. But then it's funny, it can be abstract. It's just like the pressures of the environment, both biological and environmental.
So
Which,
knowing the results from this particular study, is it, so I guess in hindsight, or now knowing what we know based on your study, can somebody develop a learning strategy or a practice routine that might help you achieve the conditions of flow to sort of optimize the outcome at the end of the day or at the end of the year? Like, how would you go into a skill that you've got intrinsic motivation for? I really want to do this. I love it. Now I know something about flow and how to enter it. I guess the first question is, can you develop a routine or a learning strategy to help you enter flow better?
yes.
Enlighten us, please.
I
Asking for a friend, but for myself, and also just as a parent, right?
Boy,
I know, big question.
like, I wish I had that. I wish I had that answer. Whenever, like, there's so many factors to take into consideration. I could give a few, like, maybe tips of what I would do for my own, like music. I mean, I don't think there's like a one size fits all type of. I'm about to do a study that's going to test if maybe doing certain things that might lead to an altered state of consciousness somehow affects your flow, the level of flow you experience in your day-to-day life. That could be something that I'm investigating and that is coming, maybe, but I don't know of much empirical work that's like looking at different strategies for improving flow. Actually, that's not true. I've gone back. There's a bunch of work by John Gruzelaire. This is the most interesting work I've ever seen on this question. John Gruzelaire is about neurobiofeedback, like alpha theta training via like having people like try to get into like a relaxed state while like doing EEG, and then if they're like within a certain alpha theta, I think, ratio, or like they get outside of that, they would like alert the person that they're like not in that. It's kind of neurofeedback training, right? Where they try to get, and then they would look at the people who made the most progress in those neurofeedback training sessions, and I think they were like music performances or a few different like tests like at the end of in three or four different studies that I saw. And I've had conversations with my PhD advisor, John Cunius, about the rigor of this work and how much I should really kind of buy into it. But that was, to me, some of the earliest work really looking to kind of see, can you get the brain in a state where it can be more likely to experience flow and like optimize and like reach an optimal performance state. And I think we've seen that type of neurofeedback paradigm grow and flourish into like the brain stimulation, TDCS, TMS, RTMS, HDTCS, TACS, like the neuromodulatory swing of things. It's funny, the Gruzelaire work actually was leading up to my first neuromodulation event was in 2015. I think it really started picking up around that same time. So in that saying, basically like, okay, so can you change the brains? Ultimately, if you're doing some behavior, you're doing a behavior probably that's going to alter your brain chemistry, the way your brain is functioning, and along with the rest of your physiology in some, at least it's some like kind of consistent way, right? Can you go into a performance and have this type of like both cognitive, emotional, psychological, like control, like this, if you can control certain elements where that they kick in when you're not feeling in flow, such as increased physiological arousal or things like psychological things like anxiety, they're related to psychological arousal, or just like a racing mind, right? And not being able to, because a racing mind is not going to let you like kind of like get into this absorbed state. Also think for any performing art, I think doing things in front of people that like all the time, just like doing things in front of people and like being able to do things when there's distractions, being able to keep focus.
So to minimize distractions, like you said earlier, from notifications, but then being able to turn down those distractions in your mind when they do occur.
turn them down.
Yeah.
Rebound when you know.
Yes.
When you know that you are not, when you're over, like, here's something that, as the music, of course, overcompensating makes it worse when you're not feeling it, because you're pushing yourself even further away from the place where you need to be.
Yeah, it's counterproductive.
To like get back. It's counterproductive. And like with improv, it just like, it unravels when there's multiple people doing it. And that's like, that's like one of the, if you want to have a deep lesson of like all the yogic training and the meditation and understanding the brain and neuroscience and music and like these pieces put together, is just like, in a moment of uncertainty, do less.
Yes.
And do less that's coming do less things that are coming internally directed from you and from internal attention, and focus on the external.
Yeah, that reminds me, without knowing anything about flow, I think back to when I was an undergrad student, and I sort of developed this practice, and now I share it with my students. It's like you've got an exam coming up, and you start to stress out, and you start stressing out, and that becomes counterproductive. So totally. You need to, it's easier said than done, but you need to not stress out, do less, and focus on the task at hand. It's a little bit analogous there, but thank you for reminding me of that, because that's something that I took away from my university studies.
It is. It's so nuanced. It really is. It's so nuanced and personal. It's like, it's so nuanced and personal for people, like, because it's like how you choose, right? It's like how you choose to spend your time. It's like the area that you care about to learn and to grow. It's easy to talk about with musicians, and it's really interesting when there's more like kind of crosstalk. I felt it very much in this like improv music silo in a lot of my work, because I was in a music engineering lab. I was like on an island doing all my own music work. The rest of my psychology classmates were, studying like disorder, like doing their disorder research, and like someone else was doing like, not many people. But when you start to, I've seen there's been more crosstalk between like the neuroscience of creativity, which flow kind of falls within that community, with just like with industry, actually, with architects and architectural design and planning. And there's so many areas of just creation and human thought, and that benefit by people being able to hone in and to like tap into their best version of themselves about things that they're passionate about. And then like when you putting a team together and putting like the right people like in a room. And on the flip side, I was like, this is like total, it's related because it all came out of all this stuff. I was like a CEO and founder of a music tech neuroscience company before I kind of went back for all this like the psychedelics work. And so much of it, like team building and like putting pieces together that will like, one piece will drive the other, where like you think that there could be this like synergy, is really, when we talk about like team synergy, or like, like part of that is like camaraderie. So you like break down the walls of like feeling anxiously, like you need these certain layers, but ultimately it's so the pieces work in this like optimal processing way. Optimal processing can be at like a person level. And I'm really like a strong believer that like optimal processing can come at a systems level.
Which is, so basically trying to, when you mentioned teams, having something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Totally. And so there's synergy there, right? And so you just mentioned systems, and it reminded me of something that we talked about earlier or previously, the idea of musicians working in a group. How is flow different? Does flow happen different? Is it triggered differently when you're working in an ensemble, in a band, in an orchestra? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
it's a tough one, because the study that you did was a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah. So like that's another cat. I'll throw all the caveat. I appreciate all like the warm feedback, and like the people like love the research. But it's funny, in my perspective, like there's all these like little caveats. It's like, yeah, again, you're missing. Yeah, of course, you're missing. It's research. You have to like kind of take a piece of it and chunk of it and like study it. Study, you
parse it out.
Yeah. You got to parse it and like define things and then be open to limitations and kind of keep progressing things as you gain knowledge. Yeah, this is like so. Two of the guys in the band I'm playing with now are bands Outer States. We just kind of launched this pretty new band a couple of weeks ago, actually. I've been improvising with them since high school. It's been over 20 years. So this is like a really, the highs are the highest highs.
Yes.
Versus like improvising by yourself. And I think, there's a lot of, there's again, the friendship, there's a lot of layers of that. There's like the time, the journey, the friendship, the shared language, the social, all those pieces. But I think it's harder. It's harder because like it really requires all four. Oh, we're four. We're like a rock quartet. For the four of us to be dialed in, and when one person, or it's like clearly that like what's going on, like you're taken out of it more. It's now you have a 1 in 4 chance. It's like a 25.
There's a dependency on there's one another, right?
There's a dependency. Yeah, like it's funny. We were just talking about this the other night, and we get to this point. We usually play on like Monday nights. And we get to this point in the night where it's like, should we play one more song? It's like, should we call it? Like we have kids and whatever. We have work the next day, and we're playing. And like, let's just whenever we stretch it, and we're a little tired, and it's like something just like happens in those moments where you're not just amped up, you're not getting there, you're in this like setback state. You are. It's just it happens like more reliably than not. When you're like, it's like pushing on, like I don't care what happens. It's almost like you throw everything out. It's like, I'm not caring about this being the best thing ever. I don't want it to be, doesn't need to be this or that. Like
I was just going to say that, where it's, you don't care anymore. You're at the end of the night. If you've bombed, you've already bombed. If you've had a good performance, that's already happened. So it's like all the barriers disappear and you can now more effortlessly get together into that flow state. I totally know what you're saying.
There's a learning curve like in a group, and like the part of the cool thing of a group is that like there's a learning curve in like everyone else's tastes, and really great music and really great groups come from when there's like this, I think, an interesting sometimes it's just like one, right? Sometimes it's just one person's vision, and like they have the creative vision and they go forward and they have the creative vision and they have the band that no one knows, like David Bowie or whoever, and like all these different people, Bruce, like all these, he's a great band, but like all these single artists. But then there's like bands who it's like it is like the sum is greater than the sum of the parts is great. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Yeah. I'm a big Fish fan. That's like a lot of these guys. Two of the guys who I've been playing music with for 20 years, we grew up listening. Like that's how that was like our first step into this realm of like rock and improvisation was through that music. And with the guitarist now, it was interesting that like we had this common, the three of us, I mentioned Sal and Nash, my two buddies, we had this like almost too common of a backgrounds. And by introducing this new piece, this is a decade ago now, we all kind of had to find this Venn diagram of like the parts of the music and the pieces of what we love. Is it how much composition, how much improv? When we say improv, what do we mean? Are there different types of improv? What are the different like moods and styles we get into? Are there certain like progressions or vocabulary we want to stay away from, or that we like? For example, you'll never hear us dropping into like blues. Like 1, 4, 5, just because like there's a thing, I don't know, I feel like it's like a trite rock thing that like everyone's like, we're much more into like a 4, like I'm not getting the music talk, but like into like 4, 6 chords, or it's kind of a 4, 6, 5, or it's like, and it just sounds like a little more, it sounds more epic and like a little, I don't know, a little more emotional to me than like this blues where like I just don't have that connection to maybe the blues music. And I've heard it so many times played by a musician who like where the blues like screams from their soul, and it's authentic. It's authentic to who they are, and that just doesn't feel right or where it comes. So like we talk about those kinds of things and stylistic choices, and I think that's all part of flow, because like without that common language and communication and understanding in the group atmosphere, those personal conversations and the discussions and the intrinsic motivation for all of the members of the group to want to achieve flow and create the best thing that they can, the optimal thing, is agreed upon. But even though not what the formula is, but it's like an active conversation of how do we get there and how do we like meet those goals.
And since you also work at the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research, are there substances that, or actually, let me ask it this way: which substances enhance your ability to enter flow, and which ones do the opposite?
I think a blanket statement like that is hard. I think being at a place like the Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research, right? It's a lot about dose.
Yes,
it's gonna be a lot about your right, a lot about dose, a lot about the specific substance that you're taking. It's gonna work a little bit differently for everyone in different situations. For me, a drink, to me, the best way to get on stage is like a drink or two.
Yeah.
Just like to kind of loosen, not more than two. If you have more than two drinks, you're not going to have your same kind of like motor control, and you don't want to lose that and start to get sloppy. But for me, that's sort of where I fall. I know there's a long history of there's like kind of, you could take it to the extremes from the Grateful Dead and the acid tests.
Mm-hmm.
You could look at old school jazz musicians, and then the kind of like there's heroin throughout like a lot of history in jazz and cocaine and a lot of rocking through the 80s, and like every substance is like associated with almost like a different genre or style. So yes. I guess part of my feelings about that cannabis weed too, part of my feelings about that is like there must be some connection between what the music is delivering and what the musicians are feeling from the substances they're taking, and also this like shared experience by the people who are enjoying the music, and that there's a resonance there between what they're creating and that the substances are being taken for the experience.
Set and setting.
Set and setting. And what you bring up is like kind of like I'm bringing up the audience in terms of this flow thing, and that's only a kind of a more recent, I think, idea that has been formalized by another collaborator of mine on the same project I was discussing previously, Alan Waterman, who's making this distinction between appreciative flow and generative flow. So we can think about that, like things like you could imagine like doing something actively and like making, just let's say music, we'll stick with it, making the music versus listening to the music. You could get into flow doing both of those activities, and like those are going to be different, right? In terms of like if we're thinking about it neurologically, they're going to be different. And I think that's a cool kind of distinction to think about.
You kind of answered a question that I was trying to formulate, is that does the product of flow always have the output or the outcome of flow always have to be productive? But no, it can be appreciative.
Well, is that it can be. I think that. Yeah. I think that it can be. And I would argue that through to, you could say like, well, it's not really. I've had these are such fascinating conversations around this one, and like the conversations like just have with collaborators around like what does this really mean, and talking about, let's try to get to these understandings through like your experience. And thinking about like challenge and skill balance, you mentioned, that's like one of the most, kind of cited and tested aspects of this flow model. And I've had the discussion is like, well, when you're appreciating something, does that still come into play? And I think it does. I think it does. I think if you're you can be someone who, I'll use my fish example. I've been to hundreds of fish shows. I've heard, I don't know how many different versions of tweezer in my life. I'll tell you, when I hear a tweezer, that like there is a challenge, like me hearing that tweezer, given my music background, improvisation background, fish background, understand like this is meaning. It's a very critical challenge skill balance that happens during the aesthetic flow. Also, you can think about that in any area. Of someone who I'm reading, I'm a movie connoisseur. Yes. I'm a style, this genre of music, or this artist that I love, or this type of comedy, or whatever it is that you take an interest in. That maps on there. I think that makes sense to me, and that maybe flow. I wouldn't call it flow. Maybe like watching, when my daughter's bringing this back, when she's watching Super Kitties.
Right. Yeah, I would agree.
She's absorbed.
Totally absorbed,
but maybe not flow.
Right. Right. No, something that you mentioned earlier was at the end of the night, you're playing a show. Should we stretch this on? And all your inhibitions are gone, and you go out there and it just works. It seems to work at that point in time. That reminds me of going into a test as a student, into exam. You're totally stressed out. I don't know how I'm going to do. You write the test, and when you're done the test, you walk out, and it's like, you know everything. It's like all your inhibitions are gone because the stress is gone. You've already performed.
You already know every answer that you got wrong and what the right answer was.
Yeah, exactly. Right? So why is it that you can't walk into an exam knowing that? Well, you can train yourself. And this is part of what I was trying to say earlier with a strategy that I developed when I was a student, is just to not stress out because it's counterproductive, and try to put yourself in the same state of mind that you are in when you leave the exam, if that makes any sense, to sort of just open the floodgates a bit more. It reminds me of the end of the night scenario that you laid out when you're playing with your band.
Yeah. Like the key is like, how do you reduce that stress? How do you reduce the buildup? How do you not get all worked up? The example I was giving, close. I was saying when we were practicing in our band room, like we can let things really stretch out at the end of the night and go like have a long improv, because there's like we can get the most comfortable in our most comfortable spot.
Yeah.
In our world is like our guitarist's house, where it's just us. There's no influence, right? It's like
no judgment.
There's no judgment, and we all just like we're just like, let's all get out there, and like I just want to spend this time listening to you guys as closely as I can and adding my part that fits, and like driving and just seeing where that takes us in the next 15 to 20 minutes. There's nothing like more exciting.
There's nothing
more exciting doing that with like your best friends in the world and people you've been like making this craft with, like and like purposefully.
Yeah.
For me, it's been like my whole adult life. And it's crazy that like I'm sitting here talking to you, and now that idea just like is my career. Like I'm looking at it as as like a scientist, and now thinking about like what you're saying is like, are there ways we can enhance it? Like to me, I think there's like an overlapping this like mindfulness. I think we know this is like, right, there's like connections here between the topics we're talking about, between flow, between altered states, between psychedelics, between meditation and yoga. We can bring in like Buddhist like thought and like and then the ideas of like Western of like ego and self and like constructs of society and what pressures are put on us, and like how I think what it really boils down to is like, how can you take kind of like what quote unquote the best optimized ways for your sense of meaning and well-being and purpose in the world, and continue to build that day in and day out through just your life and like the things that you do and the activities you partake in and the people you surround yourself with.
Yeah. For anybody who's never performed, I'm going to keep it to what I know, and it's the same thing that rock performance as a band. For anybody who's not done that before, it's hard to understand or imagine the joy that comes out of that flow state. It's one of the best feelings in the world, and I think you kind of alluded to it earlier. As an audience member watching that, you're thinking, what's happening there? What is that performer feeling? And that's what he's feeling. And part of that might be the appreciative flow that you're talking about. So it's like tapping into someone else's flow state as an audience member, which is, I find that very interesting. Can you talk to us a little bit about Secret Chord's Laboratories? Labs?
I don't think I'm allowed to talk about Secret Chord Labs.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't think that I can. Yeah, I guess I could make some high level comments about Secret Chord Laboratories.
Yeah, what is it?
It's an inactive company. No. So Secret Chord Laboratories was born out of my work with Scott Miles, who was a fellow collaborator. He was a researcher at Georgetown University, a fellow music neuroscientist, who crossed paths with me while I was at Drexel by happenstance. He was looking for a really good technical person to make these models of harmonic expectation in popular music. And basically looking for a way to quantify these ideal patterns of harmonic surprise that tend to occur in top charting, Billboard charting songs over a 60-year period, compared to songs that either don't make the charts or at the bottom of the charts.
Are you loosely referring to the hook in a song?
The hook is part of the harmonic surprise, but to me, it's not the crucial part.
Okay.
The hook, I would say, is like kind of the earworm that you can sing back. That's prominent in a lot of pop music. But what we were really calculating was the most surprising moment harmonically in a given piece of music,
okay.
and then the total amount of surprising moments or chords throughout a piece, and getting different kind of quantifications of that. And so I say it's the hook usually is on the back end of the most surprising moment. In a general pop structure, what we found is the most surprising moment generally happens between the bridge and the third chorus.
Yes.
Pop song. Of course, there's a million different song structures. So this is like, but the best kind of like formula you could lay out is like, that's when there's usually a new chord that's never even been heard in the song during the bridge is introduced. It's a brand new harmonic moment. And that rise in tension, you could think, if we want to think about in terms of evolution, that rise in tension, this idea kind of put out by David Huron about expectations in music, and others, is like almost like a tense. It's tense. It's almost like a pain response. And the hook is the chorus. It's the most familiar part. It's the part that you know, and that it's the least surprising. So you have the most amount of contrast. So what we did is we were finding these moments of contrastive harmonic surprise in all these pop songs. So it's kind of like this very surprising moment going into the hook. Published some papers on that based on what we saw in past pop music. And then we were like, oh, this is like interesting. It doesn't have to just be harmony that we're looking at. We should be looking at things like melodic surprise. And we should be looking at rhythmic surprise. And we should be looking at timbral surprises. And we should be looking at lyrical surprises and textural surprises. There's like all these different levels of surprise within the music that we could look at. Then not only could we look at like past songs, we could start to like maybe predict on new songs based on past music. How do they match certain surprise profiles based on their genre or based on an artist's like how far along in their career there are, or like basically what we ended up doing was we took this kind of core intellectual property, we patented this harmonic surprise calculation, and we started using that on top of all these different other just this like raw music features, aspects of quantitative things about the music called like music information retrieval, along with all these other metrics around like previous artists, like, track like success on like streaming, if they've ever been on like the charts before, if it was a single on an album, how many previous albums, like all the metrics you can imagine, right? Like what people in the music industry were looking at and trying to build on top of that with this layer of neuroscience based analytics that would help you kind of like separate out potential hit songs from non-hit songs.
Interesting.
So what we did with that was, I think neither of us had business experience, Scott nor I really, of running a company. I ended up my dad had always been in business. I kind of like knew nuts and bolts, but did a lot of learning along the way and made a lot of first-time founder startup mistakes. As we had more advisors, we'd hear these like, oh my God, we're doing that. Like we're trying to like build this thing and spending money on whatever before we, actually know the market for who wants this tool for like harmonic surprise, and like where is it most, does a musician want it when they're sitting down looking at their final mix being like, right. Oh, there's a section of my song that says it could benefit from more harmonic surprise. What if I tried a new chord and like tried to bring that harmonic surprise level up? Maybe that could help my song. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe. So that was like one angle. We were talking to people there, and the record labels, they were like some people were like, we don't want our A&R jobs are gone if we have this doper thing. Like we don't want to embrace, it says the same thing that our people say. Like that's great, but okay, we're saying that. So I think it was fascinating as a researcher to go on that journey of looking through all these we learned a lot about like how these different surprise elements by different genres, like for example, harmony had like more of an impact in like country music or rock. And we saw like rhythm and timbres having like more impact in like R&B and hip hop. Like, so some simple distinctions between like, and how genres might manipulate, or how like different than cross genres might use surprise in different ways. So we started to learn different kinds of patterns about how like surprise is used and when it matters the most. Like, I think we learned that we tried to create these really like robust models, like any song that came out by any artist and like of a certain ilk, that we'd be able to like put a good like kind of like score or surprise score on it. And I think what I learned the most is not as the person who like started doing the research from the beginning, not as the person running the company, was that like I thought where it really worked and had the most legs was for artists who had like kind of the deepest catalog. So the artists who had like an artist where like their listening universe is like compared to them, right? Like when Taylor Swift releases a new song, Taylor Swift's new songs aren't being compared to all of the other top, like Taylor Swift's on her own level, of course, but like all the other top female pop artists of her genre. No, it's like Taylor Swift's songs are like listening to this song as people who deeply know Taylor Swift.
Right.
So we did a lot of beta testing around like top tier artists who had like really large catalogs. And we saw that actually like, Surprise was like the most important in like, if we like looked at it as like predicting like what would be a cult classic that wasn't a single that like the fans really love and like is like it's like a different kind of vibe for that person's like fans. It makes sense because there's like this layered knowledge of really deep knowledge of like active comparison between like the previous repertoire. And you could imagine that like from a perception audience or someone listening to it, not having any idea that like any of this surprise is happening or that any of it exists in the music, is just like, oh, this is like a different take or a different kind of thing that this artist I like is doing. And because you have that like emotional attachment to artists you love through your life experience, through your friendships, through your trips, through your shows, through your, you know, all the different reasons why we love artists. And then now that's, I think, almost like a critical leaning in. This is what we always talked about the company was lean in listening. My third founder, Rob, he was in the music industry. We grew up together. He was always like, there's this like important distinction between like lean in listening and passive listening. And streaming now more than ever has like made us more of like a passive listening. I'll throw on the playlist for like when I'm cooking dinner, or I'll throw on the playlist for when I'm I have a playlist for everything. But like, what am I listening to when I'm the one picking, when I'm picking the artist and I'm really choosing, like, this is the next, someone recommended this to me, or like, here's like I'm like really digging into my favorite artists and like artists because I'm trying to actively discover something that's like, it's kind of like this, but a little different. And so you can imagine when you start to have that more, you know, like lean in experience, that I think it starts to make a little more a sense of like how these like really kind of like maybe buried musical features might give rise to like increased preference. But that story, as much as that story makes sense that I just told, it doesn't explain why we looked at pop at like Billboard charting songs over the past 60 years, looking at the top quartile and bottom quartile only at harmonic surprise, and the songs in the top quartile had like clearly different patterns of harmonic surprise, because like Billboard songs, I guess by definition they're heard a lot, but they don't necessarily have, I guess, and during the Billboard era, or especially earlier Billboard eras, maybe there was like just less access to like more music, and like that had an influence of like why that was happening. But there's some unclear relationships there of just like maybe how these pieces are interacting. I think just the reality is there's just too many variables to fully model like what's going to be, you know, the next hit, and that type of like ambition was maybe in the first place overly zealous.
The lessons learned. The idea of lean in listening, that's interesting. Like even physically, when you said it, you actually leaned in, and that reminds me of, you've got a turntable and you've got a vinyl on there, you put it on and you sort of lean in, you sit next to it and you listen, which is not really what we do anymore, right? With the streaming. So that's a very interesting point. Now, some of us do, but in general, with streaming, while you're cutting the grass, while you're cooking, you're passively listening.
Yeah, it's different. It's different. Yeah. I always find it's funny how mediums technology is, man, how
change things, right?
Change really just like totally shape things.
Okay, just a couple last question, if you don't mind, as we wrap it up. What is really cool about your story is, you alluded to it, is that you have been a musician for a long time, and you were once also a teacher, and somehow you found yourself studying the thing that you love the most. I won't make that value judgment for you, but the music, you love it. It's a passion. But somehow you found yourself changing careers, and now you're studying it on a different level. So what would your advice be to young students, scientists, somebody looking for vocation, not just a career? Like, how do you go about aligning those two things together? I know it's a tough, big question, but you embody that really well.
I appreciate that. It's not easy. It was never easy. I think along the way, I think there's a lot of people. I'm at Hopkins now. Like, Hopkins gets a different kind of student. A lot of the students are like they have a path. They like a professional career path. And a lot of people have a professional career path that they like really want.
Intrinsic motivation.
No, extrinsic motivation.
Extrinsic?
Yeah, I think like the path, I think a lot of people's decisions about their path is based on like, I need to get this. Okay. I want to be a doctor. I need to be a lawyer. I need to be 100%. This is what I need to be.
Gotcha.
Maybe I can't say it's totally extreme. I think there's lots of people who just like in their heart of hearts want to save lives and become a doctor. And that's their purpose in life is nothing else but to give themselves to help in the quality. And I would think that hopefully that's a lot of doctors feel that way. Is that for lawyers? Do lawyers feel like my mission in life, I'm intrinsically motivated because like more above and beyond just like because I want to stand for like I believe this like the law and like people need to be protected and innocent people need to be people who are in charge of things need to like but like I guess for me it was always like not it was the flexibility of career, but it was not but like the almost like the except for teaching when outside of music, it was always like somehow tying back to like a topic. But like it could have been a lot of different careers around that topic. Like it was like music, it was like a music teaching, it was like, or music research, or like the altered states is like the psychedelics are related, or like, oh, maybe you could be like a company could happen out of this, or it was just like taking the mentality of like the next, if you do something you really love and you do it well, then you're going to be equipped with a set of skills that's going to put you in position for your next step forward. And it takes a certain leap of faith or to like know that and to be pursuing that without the guarantee that there were no music neuroscience jobs when I started undergrad. Psychedelics research was like not even a thing. It didn't even exist. I think we tell our kids this a lot, like not really understanding is that like, you don't know what your job is. I have a 4-year, even 5-year-old, right? You don't know what your job is going to be. You don't even know what the jobs are. What is a job going to be in 15 years? So you can only really like prepare yourself and do things that you like deeply care about and you think are going to better you in some way and prepare you and give you skills for your next, whatever you decide your next path is. And I guess it's just been able to take one step at a time. It's like the most cliche like sports thing, like take one game at a time, take one day at a time, and having those conversations when you're 40, thinking about that when you're 40, it's easier to think about than when I have 25-year-old interns or 22-year-old interns who feel like the world is, if they don't have this degree or finish this project by like this timeline or get the thing by like the month and day that they want, then like everything's going to fall apart and they're like not going to meet the goals of their life. Like, so I think that with time you start to maybe just like think about, with time you think about how you spend your time maybe differently. I don't know if that's any practical advice for everyone.
No, I mean hindsight's 20/20, but that's why we learn from other people who've been there.
It's just like you need to be true to yourself. Right. And for some people you need to have like everyone has different needs. Everyone has different like wants and goals. Different people are open to like have different levels of openness in terms of like how flexible they are around those goals and like what the different pieces of their life that they need. I think just like something that's not about flow or like shaping your career, just like a personal development type of thing is just like to understand like what is the core of like you, like what are the things you care the most about. And I remember like jotting down like 5 or 6 things and just being like, okay, well, here's the 5 or 6 things that like I need to do every week or every day. And like, how can I have I'm a calendar person. How can I block my calendar where it's like, oh, I got an hour here. I can like, instead of like fiddle around and do nothing, like what can I stick on my calendar? So I know like, okay, maybe for 50 minutes, I'm doing that. And like throughout the week, if I achieve 80% of my calendar, like I'm an all-star. I'm like, I feel great. I'm like, oh my God, what a great week. And like, whatever. Like sometimes it falls apart and something comes up and you don't get to it. But like it takes, I always heard this thing like you can only do, you can only do 2 things well or something. You can do 2 things well.
So do them really well.
2 things really well. So like do them really well and then make sure you're mixing in the other pieces of your life that are going to help make you whole.
I think that's a wonderful bow to put on it. Dr.
Cool.
Rosen, thank you so much for talking to you. It was
Thanks for having me.
speaking with me. It was fascinating, and I look forward to the next study that you're gonna be working on with your partner from in England. I think you mentioned.
Yeah, from Goldsmiths, Oliver.
Gotcha. Beautiful. We'll be looking for that. Can we find your music anywhere?
Yeah, sure. We're on Spotify. We're on all the social medias. Outer States Bands. We're just called Outer States on Spotify. Actually, we have a new track coming out tomorrow. It's called Flow States 2.
Wonderful.
So
by the time I publish this, that will be linked at the bottom, I promise you.
Oh, that's awesome. And that's just some straight improv from the Murder House.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Take care.